The two great lessons that I learned first was that with no experience in a canoe, no experience as a camper or an outdoorsy kind of guy, a nature lover, I learned a love of nature and I figured out that I am capable of doing anything. There is nothing a person who can canoe the Mississippi River with no experience, there is nothing he cannot do after that. You walk away with a confidence that you did not, a self-assuredness that you maybe did not have going into it.
Hello, intrepid listeners, and welcome to the Carpe Diem Live Your Dream podcast. My guest this episode is Eddie Harris, and I'm extra honored to have him on the show for several reasons. First, because like me, but a few years earlier than me, he paddled down the entire Mississippi River, and I'm looking forward to comparing our respective stories. But I'm also honored because he took things two big steps further than me. He wrote a book about his journey called Mississippi Solo that in part inspired my own adventure on the river. And then some 30 years later, Eddie actually paddled the Mississippi a second time, something that has gotten me dreaming about a repeat trip as well. I hope you enjoy the show as much as I do. Eddie Harris, welcome to the show. I have a ton of questions about your Mississippi River adventures, but first, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I grew up in St. Louis and have had an attraction to the river since I was small. So my doing the river comes partly out of that attraction, but also partly out of American mythology and my desire to put those two things together.
Tell me about that a little bit, because Mississippi River does have just an incredible history, to me at least, a lot of mystique. You grew up near that, and it prompted you to actually go paddle down the river. How did that view of the river trigger your adventure story paddling down it?
It inspires the entire adventure. Well, first, a little backstory about why I decided to do it when I decided to do it. So as I said, I'm a writer, and for a very long time, I had wanted to be a writer ever since the end of my 3 weeks at IBM after I graduated university. I had those 3 weeks because that's what people do. You finish university, you get a job.
So that was your quote, real job for 3 weeks, right?
That was the real job, the only job I have had, the only real job I have had, and I did not like it. I did not like being in an office. I did not like wearing a suit to work. I did not like confined hours. So I quit the job, and then I just went back off to California where I had gone to school, and I tried to be a writer. I was a writer because that's what I did. I wrote, but I wasn't making any money. I never got anything published. I sold a couple of short things for newspapers and did some work for a filmmaker in Hollywood a couple of times, or a couple of filmmakers. But I wasn't satisfied. I had written 5 or 6, I can't even remember now how many. I'd written 5 or 6 novels that did not get published, that got some attention from editors who thought that they were well written, but not well written enough to be commercial, I suppose. And the trip down the Mississippi River comes out of a sense of desperation, wanting and needing to do something to get in touch with myself, change my life, and see if I had the stamina, to do the river, which I would then translate into the stamina to continue being a writer. It's hard to be a writer with no success. You've got nothing to show for it. You're just doing this thing into the wind. And it's kind of like canoeing the river. I'm just doing this thing into the wind. Nobody will ever know about it unless I write a book about it, of course. But otherwise, it's just self-actualizing adventure. It's just for me. And I figured that if I could do that with no real purpose behind it, because I was not thinking about writing a book when I set out. I was just canoeing the Mississippi River and seeing what that would lead me to. And if I could do this thing, sort of spitting into the wind, then I could continue being a writer spitting into the wind with no visible reward at the end except the fact that I had done it, the fact that I had done the river, the fact that I had written books and continued to write books whether they got published or didn't. So all of that was sort of mixed up in the impetus to go do this crazy thing.
Interesting. First, I have to commend you for recognizing after only 3 weeks that the corporate world wasn't the place for you, because it takes some people 30 years to figure that one out. The second thing, it sounds like the river then was almost just a trip of self discovery, self reset in your life.
Absolutely is a trip of self-discovery. It is where I found out who I am, what I am capable of, and only when you're alone in that kind of adversity do you really, really face yourself. And that's what, and in fact, that is where the book comes from having this adventure, which was so overwhelmingly important to me that I thought, well, I got to share this with somebody.
First of all, for the listeners, I have to advocate reading Eddie's book, Mississippi Solo, because it triggered me to actually go paddle the river. It's such a hard concept to really describe to other people. Eddie, you just said it was such a profound experience. I have a hard time explaining my 2 months rowing down the river. How would you explain the challenges that lead to the growth? Give a crack at explaining what was triggered in you and how it was triggered.
The encounters are probably the most important aspect of the journey. I'm a pretty shy person. I did not just go up to strangers and have conversations with them. On the river, because I am black, because I'm alone, I became a kind of object of curiosity, and people called me to them. And it sparks a series, all down the river, a series of conversations that were enlightening. And part of what's important about this trip to me is not only what I discovered about me, but what I discovered about my fellow Americans. And one of my messages when I talk a lot to kids and young people, not just little kids, but young people, and I encourage them to do things like this. And one of the reasons is very political, and it comes from the sense that we just don't know each other as Americans, as neighbors. And the generosity that I encountered as I'm going down the river both times was just astounding. Because when you turn on the television set and you watch the news or read the paper, it sometimes seems like everything that happens is bad. Only the bad stuff gets reported. And nobody talks about the number of people who invite you in for a beer or a coffee or something to eat as you're paddling down the river. And I recognize that somebody paddling down the river is an oddity. It's not something that you see every day. So, and the person in that canoe is fairly vulnerable. So it's easy to have a conversation with that person. And yet, what I experienced internally in those encounters was a profound sense of connectedness to my fellow Americans. It was just gratifying. The first time and the second time. And the second time even more profound because the second journey was less about me than it was about exploring or rediscovering the country. And it comes down finally to the generosity of strangers and how nice people can be when you're alone and vulnerable.
I remember a quote from you in short film you did on the second paddling. And the quote, I think, if I get it right, went like this. What I discovered when canoeing down the Mississippi River is both of those two trips illuminated an aspect of America that we just don't get to see. And part of the reason we don't get to see it is we don't look for it. And I loved that quote, that grassroots view of how wonderfully kind the average human is out there if you just give it a chance. That's, I think, what you're saying, right?
That is exactly what I'm saying. And if you could be in this room with me right now, you would see my face just beaming as you say that. Because that is, in fact, what it's all about. Just getting to know each other. And it doesn't have to be canoeing the Mississippi River. It can be bicycling. It can be just talking to somebody in the grocery store. It's what we don't do because we are somehow afraid of the other. And when we're not afraid of the other and we approach the other, 9 times out of 10 turns out right. And I'm so proud of the people who welcomed me. There was a woman on the second journey whose door I knocked on in the middle of the night.
Hmm.
It was dark, and I just didn't feel like pitching my tent. And I saw her, and it's a small town called Clayton in Iowa. It's a seasonal town, and it's closed up. And her light from her kitchen is the only light anywhere around. And for some strange reason, I went up, knocked on the door, and it was a hotel closed for the season. And I knocked on her door and and when she opened the door, the first thing out of my mouth was, "What's for dinner?" I didn't say hello. I didn't say how are you. I didn't say excuse me, lady. I said, "What's for dinner?" And she responded in a way that seemed to indicate she was waiting for me, but also as if big black men come off the river every evening and knock on her door and ask what's for dinner. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even blink. She just said, "I'm making soup," and that was the beginning of a fantastic evening where we shared a bowl of soup, and she opened the room for me, and it was just fantastic. And that sort of, to me, symbolizes emblematically the entire journey, the entire history of my travels in America, where people open their doors, open their arms, open their hearts to you, and share. That's the America that I see every day.
Yeah, and I can see why you are encouraging the young people in our country to get out and have those kinds of experiences. Why do you think more people don't give that sort of adventure a try?
Partly, I think it's fear. Partly, I
Hmm.
think it's habit. If I had not been in this situation of literary desperation, I never would have canoed the Mississippi River. It was not in my frame of reference. Canoeing, I was not an outdoorsy guy. This was not something that came naturally to me. I had been in a canoe maybe a handful of times with a bunch of guys from high school drinking beer. That was my canoeing experience, and mostly that was my outdoorsy. I had never been. I'd been camping once, I think, before then.
So the fact that that all came together, that's almost like a miracle that all those stars align for someone like you to do that. For me, I came up in a childhood of canoeing and camping, and I crossed the country on a bicycle, wanted to replicate it north to south on the river. So it was pretty natural transition for me. I'm just amazed that you actually had the gumption to just put the boat in the water and go for it. Did you ever question your sanity or think about quitting or almost not go?
I never questioned going or not going. Once I made the decision to go, which was made in Pennsylvania, as I was driving across Interstate 70, going toward the place where I was living at the time, which was Dover, Delaware, and I crossed a bridge which crossed a river, and that's when the idea hit me sort of full force. I closed up the house in Delaware, drove back to St. Louis, and started the process of getting stuff together. It was nothing that was in my internal makeup. As I said, I'm not an outdoorsy. I was not at the time. I am now, but I was not an outdoorsy kind of guy.
Are you telling me that this whole idea was almost spontaneous as you crossed a river bridge?
It was almost spontaneous as I crossed the river bridge.
Okay, that's freaky. I did not know that about the origins of your journey, but I was driving across the Interstate 494 river bridge over the Mississippi in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, on New Year's Day when I looked down and saw an ice floe floating down the river, and I thought, I wonder how long it would take that ice floe to reach the Gulf. I know. I'm going to paddle down the river and see. We had the same origin to our
It
trips
it is
in a way.
amazing. It is
Funny,
amazing.
funny. So you talked about what might inhibit people. You got to bring home the bacon, right? You got to live. You need a income, and these things are not cheap in terms of time. They can be quite inexpensive in terms of cash, I would say. But you also mentioned fear might be an inhibitor. And it was interesting. I don't know if you experienced the same, but when I was planning to go and when I was on the river and after I finished the river and was talking to people about it, almost inevitably, the first question out of their mouth would be, wasn't that dangerous? Isn't that dangerous? And at first I thought they were talking about being on the river itself. It's a big river. But then they would continue asking, well, you're carrying a gun, aren't you? And it never even crossed my mind to carry a gun. I wouldn't know what to do with a gun. And no, it wasn't dangerous. I had one or two situations that were a little bit creepy, but I don't think in reality they were ever dangerous. It was probably more my, natural inhibitions generated by whatever media. Tell me your experience in terms of the fears you had or other people might have versus the reality.
I did have an encounter with a couple of guys. I did have a gun, but the gun I took was taken because part of my Wild West fantasy was I was going to live off the land. I was going to hunt, shoot a couple of squirrels, shoot a couple of rabbits, skin them, and cook them up. It turned out that that was totally impractical and it never happened. But the fact that I had the gun sort of came in handy one evening in Mississippi when a couple of guys stumbled into my camp or came into my camp and basically harassed me. And they had been hunting, they were carrying shotguns,
Hmm.
and they made all kinds of comments that raises the hairs on the back of your neck.
Yeah.
So luckily I had the pistol and extracted myself from that situation because of the pistol.
Hmm.
However, it is possible that I overreacted, that the pistol was not necessary, that they were
Hmm.
just either drunk or pretending to be aggressive. I don't know. But the beauty of the encounter was the lesson I took away from it. And I didn't take it away from the encounter. I took it away from a friend's comment when he read that episode in Mississippi Solo because I call these guys racist rednecks. And my friend Brian asked me, how did you know they were racist?
Hmm.
And of course, I don't. All I could really say was their actions, which spurred my reactions, seemed dangerous. So I thought, this is a sort of sidebar, because that encounter was important because it removes racism from much of what happens to me, the good things and the bad. Because if I'm going to attribute every bad thing that happens to me to the racism of another actor, then shouldn't I attribute good things to racism too? The fact that I am black could engender negatives. It could engender something positive. But I don't want to live that way. I am too old and too feeble to carry the racist intentions of someone else on my shoulders all the time. So
Yeah,
I
that's a
look at the
nice.
action and only the action, and not trying to get into somebody's head and read his intention.
I like the perspective, Eddie. I had a similar encounter. I was actually on the rowboat and approached by four guys in Louisiana on a power boat who I think in the end were just being mischievous jerks. But that was a pretty creepy episode. And it was white guys and white guys. So I don't think there was racism involved. I never had to face it maybe from the perspective you did, but I do like the way you put that into perspective.
So it may be prudent to be cautious in situations like that.
That's the dilemma, I think, Eddie. When you say fear is perhaps one of the factors that keep more people from going out and doing little adventures like this, and yet we all acknowledge, yes, there are dangers. I would argue, and these are random numbers I'm throwing out, I would argue that there's one uncomfortable, creepy, potentially dangerous incident for every 100 phenomenal, positive, heartwarming incidences. And we've got to get out there to have the 100 fantastic ones. And the probabilities are just astronomical that it's going to go south with one of the bad ones. And that's been my philosophy. And that's what I want to stick to encourage people to go out there.
It's
Do you
my
agree?
philosophy too. And it's not just my philosophy, but it's my experience. So I've been on the river twice now, and the only negative the only negative encounter with other people was this one encounter. I've had people in power boats come up to me and hang onto my canoe or have me hang on to their boat while we drifted and just had a conversation. And somebody passed me a beer. Somebody passed me. Somebody had been in the military and he had MREs in his boat, and he gave me MREs to take along. My experience has been totally, except for the one, it is overwhelmingly positive.
What prompted your second trip? And what was it? Almost a 30-year, 25, 30-year gap between the
it
two?
was
What
it
prompted
was a
that?
30-year gap or 29-year gap, I think. What spurred the second journey was partially the presidency of Barack Obama. He was in the middle of his second mandate, and I wanted to see how the country, if the country had changed, and how the country had changed. And I know, of course, the country has changed because things change every day. And I could see how the country had changed too, but what I was more keenly interested in was, did Obama's election mean something beyond what you could see in front of your eyes? Did Obama's election indicate that we had passed through a barrier? And in a personal way, as I'm canoeing down the river and talking to this lady in Iowa and asking her what's for dinner, I see that. And part of the impetus for the second journey was, do people live their vote? That's the takeaway now, looking in the rearview mirror. What I was looking for basically was my country. Is it still my country? Do I have a place here? Do I feel like I belong here?
And what was your conclusion? What was your observation?
My observation was the lady in Iowa, some guy giving me MREs, another guy giving me another beer, some guy giving me a packet of hot dogs, just a packet of hot dogs. The generosity of all the people that I ran across. Yes, this is my country, and I do have a place here. And people do not necessarily vote the way they live or live the way they vote. And that was encouraging. It was heartwarming.
Yeah, I have a hard time describing this, but I think I can see evidence of that where people behave differently in one-on-one encounters than they do in, I'll call it groupthink, or, it's not mob mentality, but when you're in a big group, or the media, the way it portrays groups of people, us, them sort of thing, is very different than the grassroots experience.
And I think that is absolutely it. And I think it is the groupthink mentality that gets us into trouble. Whereas one on one, this one young person, me, knocking on a door, a big young person, I am not small, knocking on the door of this woman's house, and she, older, much older, whiter, and really small. But one on one, it's just human with human, American and American. And it was the most warming experience that you can imagine. It just worked out perfectly. And I
I
think
love
that's
it.
it. I think individual in front of another individual, it takes the groupthink out of the equation.
Yeah, and I think the more each and every one of us can have those kinds of experiences, I think the better off we'll behave in group settings as well.
I think so too.
Yeah, so let me take that, go full circle back to in the beginning when I asked you what prompted the trip, and it sounded like it was a little bit of you needed that journey of self-discovery. Coming out of the first trip in particular, or the second one, what would you say in a nutshell you gained from that personally? How did you grow? Did you achieve what you had set out to achieve?
Well, easier on the first one than on the second one, since the first one really was the internal journey as much as it was a physical journey on the Mississippi. And those two come together in the two great lessons that I learned. First was that with no experience in a canoe, no experience as a camper or an outdoorsy kind of guy, a nature lover, I learned a love of nature, and I figured out that I am capable of doing anything. There is nothing a person who can canoe the Mississippi River with no experience, there is nothing he cannot do after that. You walk away with a confidence that you did not, a self-assuredness that you maybe did not have going into it. I had no idea that I was going to survive. Coming out, I not only survived, but I survived with a flourish. I walk away with a head swelled with self-confidence. That's lesson number one, that I can do anything I put my mind to.
That is beautifully stated because that is a common theme I hear from others I've interviewed for this podcast. Please
For
continue.
sure, for sure. And the second is 2 months by myself, I learned that I like myself. I like myself a lot. And the question I was constantly asking is, and I constantly ask even now, is do I like the person that I'm in this canoe with? Do I like me? Do I like me enough to continue this journey together with me? I know it sounds kind of weird, but that's one way of looking at the person that you're traveling this long road with. Do I like him? If I do, everything's copacetic. If I don't, then I need to change some things. So you talked about the courage to, or the awareness of leaving that IBM job after my my first those 3 weeks. That's an awareness too, and the awareness is that I like myself enough not to put myself through things that aren't going to get me to where I want to go. And
Mm-hmm.
the underscore on that one is, where do I want to go? I have to have enough time to sit and think and project forward. And being alone in a canoe gives you that opportunity. Alone in a canoe for 2 months, you have plenty of time to think. There's not much else you're doing. You're paddling, you're singing songs, and you're thinking. You're thinking about life. You're thinking about what's going on around you. It's a life basically with no distractions. You're alone with yourself, and that's who you're going to be with for the rest of your life. And I discovered on this journey, if I didn't know it before, I knew at the end of this journey that I liked myself a lot.
That's a rare and priceless opportunity to just have that uninterrupted, undistracted time to self reflect. And we don't get enough of that in our crazy day to day lives. Nobody really does. And being someplace alone out in nature, whether it's on a canoe or rowboat or bicycle or walking, is an opportunity for exactly that. It's very healthy. I encourage everybody to make opportunities like that.
Yeah, I think it's very healthy and very satisfying and very necessary as well. And when I got off the river, as I said before, I was not a hiker, camper, outdoorsy kind of guy, but I became one because of this experience on the river. And I started taking long, long hikes, not transcontinental hikes, but long and bicycle trips too, just long days out on my own sorts of experiences.
Eddie, you have written numerous books, done some filmmaking. Just give us a quick overview of what are some of the things you have out there.
That have been published in the US, there are only four: Mississippi Solo, Native Stranger, which is the journey I took across Africa, South of Haunted Dreams, which is the motorcycling trip in the South, and a book about Harlem called Still Life in Harlem, where I decided to go live in Harlem for a couple of years. And I made a documentary film about the second journey down the Mississippi River. I was shadowed by a film crew.
And I love that. I think it does a beautiful job of depicting the beauty of the river. Really, it's well
Yeah,
captured.
it's a lovely piece of work.
Wow. So that book writing, Eddie, this podcast traditionally has been about outdoor adventures, but ultimately I think I'll expand into just encouraging people to do other things that they're dreaming to do, like writing a book, which is a dream I still have. And I told you earlier, I meant to write a book twice across America about my bicycle journey coast to coast and my Mississippi River trip. I have yet to do it. I started, found it very difficult, found that life took hold, and now 25 years later, I have only one chapter to show for it. Tell me about the authorship experience since your first trip. Has it gotten easier?
It has gotten harder because it is, I have more experience and I know where the fault lines are. To explain that, when I got around to writing Mississippi Solo as a piece of nonfiction, I didn't know what I was doing. I knew how to write a novel. I thought I knew how to write a novel. When it came to writing nonfiction, I had no idea. And the reason I think Mississippi Solo worked was that I didn't know what I was doing. I was not at all trying to guide the reader someplace. I just told the reader what I thought, what I felt, what I saw, what I heard, and what I did. It was just the language is simple, the story is simple. 30 years on, now I'm thinking about the reader more than I thought about him or her in the first book. Now I'm thinking, how do I impart a particular message to the reader at this particular point in the story? And that makes it much more difficult. Writing solo was harder than paddling the river. Partly because I didn't know what I was doing, and partly because I'm redoing the river.
Interesting. Well, I can attest to the comment you made that writing the book is harder than paddling the river. I could paddle the river, but I have not been able to write the book. I may come back to you on that one for some tips and ideas in the future if I ever pick up the pen again. Eddie, I always ask this as the last question of my guests. What do you have planned for your next big dream adventure?
Well, before I get to the next big dream adventure, let me just say that writing the book and paddling the river are very similar in that what you have to do is do it. You have to become a Nike commercial and just do it
Yeah.
without worrying about the end result. You just have to do it. My next big crazy adventure is likely to be in Southeast Asia, just traveling around. I mean, I'm traveling all the time. I've been to war zones. I was in Ukraine last year during the craziness that's happening there. And I would like just a quiet trip through Southeast Asia to Thailand, to Bali, to Burma, on my way to Laos, where I could spend some time just chilling. And that's it. So it's not a great adventure, but that's something that's on my mind that I would like to do.
That sounds like an adventurer. That sounds like a traveler that you describe yourself as. I encourage you to do it. I look forward to the next book that comes out of it because I'm guessing you might have one in mind.
It's a pretty good guess.
Eddie, thank you so much for this time together. I was thrilled to share this with someone who had a similar experience to mine on the Mississippi. It is such a remarkable river.
It is a beautiful river, and I thank you, Dale, for exposing your listeners to it. And to me. Thank you.
All right. You have a good day. Thanks for listening to the Carpe Diem Live Your Dream podcast. If you like the show, there's nothing more valuable to me than you following it and sharing it with others. I drop a new episode every Friday, so tune in again for another great adventure story. And check out the accompanying website, www.gocarpediemnow.com, and then go seize the day and live your dream.